Let me set the backdrop because I think this is really interesting. Sri Lanka enforced one of the world's strictest, China-esque COVID-19 lockdowns, despite one of the lowest death rates and infection rates in the world. And so for nearly 3 months, it literally crippled the economy and the livelihood of citizens there. But here's where it gets crazy. Then they actually go against global best practice and they ban the burial of COVID-19 victims, claiming that it could lead to groundwater contamination. I don't even know how they came up with this. But you know what this did was it significantly undermined the small minority of the country that is Muslim, because a religious practice there, is you bury your dead. And then that caused great pain to them. And then as in turn, it hurt all these international relationships with all these Gulf nations. So then you come all the way around and then you go back to those same Gulf nations a few months later and you're like, can I have subsidized oil? And they're like, no, not so much. In March of 2020, the Central Bank of Sri Lanka began printing money in order to finance a growing budget deficit. Again, happens in many countries. And they did that in part to fulfill an election promise that they made that they would maintain single-digit interest rates. Again, sounds really familiar. They printed about 100 billion rupees in March. In the next 2 years, the central bank printed 1.65 trillion rupees, so 16 and a half times that first number. And then as a result, what they saw was the highest inflation in post-independence history. So time after time, what you're actually seeing in Sri Lanka is not a microcosm of something that's endemic to a frontier country, a Southeast Asian country. In fact, it actually resembles many of the policies that exist in so many countries all around the world. And what's really important here is that as goes Sri Lanka, so goes Ghana, so goes Pakistan, so goes a whole bunch of countries where you're already starting to see food riots, food insecurity, energy insecurity, rampant inflation, sovereign defaults. And you have to ask yourself, how are we going to really tourniquet this whole thing, reset writ large the gerontocracy that runs many of these countries, including the United States, quite honestly, remove most of the executive power from the presidency, make it a true, parliamentary style system with an empowered prime minister and empowered elected officials, and let the country run and fix itself, deprioritize some defense spending, deprioritize the growth of the public sector, reprioritize the growth of the private sector. I hope they're successful. I would love to invest, if given the opportunity, under those kinds of market conditions, and I would love to go back at some point. By the way, here's another thing that happens in a lot of these developing countries. So in the middle of all of this chaos, what do you think happened? The parliament got together, they passed an amendment to the constitution, and it enforced and it gave incremental power to one individual, the president. And typically in most of these countries that run by a parliamentary system, the president is a figurehead, right? The person shows up, shakes hand, kisses babies, that's it, right? Maybe convenes a Senate, but that is it. Now all of a sudden the person has control over defense, control over budget, control over the central bank, and this person cannot be, voted out in a no confidence vote the same way that a prime minister can. That happened here as well. So yet another example of if you start to see a bunch of autocrats in some of these developing markets feel like the answer is more power, it's been tried here, it didn't work. So I think that there's a lot of lessons. I am a little concerned and skeptical that many of these other developing countries that are teetering on insolvency will actually learn. By the way, and this is the most literate country in the world. You have to understand, the people in that country, the human potential in that country is incredible, okay? There are not developing countries like this that have this type of literacy, and the kindness of the people. These are incredible, hardworking people. But the elected class is some of the most inward, navel-gazing, corrupt people. And this is the opportunity for the young people of that country to wipe the slate clean with all of them. Sri Lanka struggled through a civil war. I was a byproduct of that civil war. It was partly religious, it was partly ethnic, and it was 20 plus years in the making and in the happening. And it took a very right-wing autocratic leader, the brother of the current deposed president, to basically root it out. Now, in order to root it out, there were enormous amounts of war crimes and all kinds of things that I don't think anybody would support, except it brought some amount of stability. And so then you would have thought, okay, maybe this is the point at which you can now really start to grow. But these guys, yet again, found a way to navel gaze and just to infuse so much corruption and graft inside of how the government was run. By the way, and it wasn't just the right, it was also the left. They spent 2.5 times more on defense as of last year than they did when they were in wartime. Doesn't make much sense. The public service grew to the largest it ever did in a moment where, you really should have prioritized private enterprise. So all of these things sort of created a situation where they fundamentally didn't know what they were doing. The problem in these last few years is that they did everything possible to not just alienate China, but to alienate everybody on every dimension possible. They alienated China. The coup de grace was that there was an enormous shipment of fertilizer, chemical fertilizer, that was sent to the ports. And it was summarily rejected and turned around because somewhere along the way, the leadership in Sri Lanka decided that they were woke. And so they had forced every farmer to go organic. The problem with going organic and organic fertilizer was all of the small farms shut down. All of the large farms had 20 to 30% crop yield reductions. The prices of food went crazy. They reversed policies 2 or 3 times. And really what they found is that, they tried to go woke. Instead, they went broke. So they offended China. They offended the Middle Easterners. They offended the Japanese by cutting a light rail project that Japan wanted to fund. And all of a sudden, all these other countries who were there trying to help said, wait, what is going on here?
There's a strong analogy between the populist uprising that's happening in the Netherlands with the Dutch farmers and the populist uprising that's happening in Sri Lanka. Basically, they're implementing the same policies. It's just that Sri Lanka is further down the road and it's a poorer country to begin with. So, like Chamath mentioned, in April of last year, the Sri Lankan government banned the importation of chemical fertilizers and pesticides used in farming. They, again, went with this idea they thought they could encourage organic farming. So the result of that was that overall production, agricultural production, fell by 1/3, and rice production fell by 43%. And rice is, the biggest staple in the country. So now you got people there starving or going hungry. You've got massive food insecurity, as well as the whole economy basically has been crippled. And the result of that is society has essentially collapsed. Now, the question is, why did the Sri Lankan government feel compelled to adopt these policies? A lot of it has to do with the fact they're getting these massive loans from the World Bank and the IMF, and the World Bank and so forth are imposing these ESG requirements. So Sri Lanka has something like a 98% ESG rating, even as their economy and society is collapsing. How is that possible? Well, they're doing a great job following the prescriptions of the global elites at Davos. I mean, this sort of global elite flies into Davos from Brussels and Washington on their private planes. They have panels on ESG, and then they prescribe these policies for countries like Sri Lanka, and this is the result. I mean, it's crazy. They've been telling us for years that somehow there's no trade-off between their environmentalist policies and creating a healthy, growing economy, and this is an example of that's not true. There are real trade-offs here, and the crazy thing is that the elites expect poor people in Sri Lanka to make up for their environmental emissions. And it's not really fair at all. But if you're in Sri Lanka and you have these massive loans and debt service, you have to do what the IMF and the World Bank, they're the ones who imposed all this stuff. So great. So Sri Lanka ends up with a 98% near perfect ESG rating, even as the country is completely collapsing. Read the Schellenberger article here. He says, the underlying reason for the fall of Sri Lanka is as leaders fell under the spell of Western green elites peddling organic agriculture and ESG. It's not that Sri Lanka's politicians implemented Sri Lankan ideas that caused the collapse of their country. They implemented the ideas they learned at Davos. And it's the people of Sri Lanka who end up paying the price